Well, hello everyone, and welcome to the new installment of our webcast, All Things Global, powered by Vistatec. I am your host, Dominica D'Agostino.
And I'm your host, Suzanne Frame.
And All Things Global is meant to inspire compelling conversations and fresh ideas for people who develop long-term global strategies. The topic of today's episode is Globalization Game Over, what is needed to achieve enterprise scale for future localization. Our brilliant guest, Don DePalma, needs no introduction. I believe you know that he's the founder and chief research officer at CSA Research, the longest running and one of the most prominent research companies in our industry. Don is actually responsible for initiating some of CSA's most notorious topics that we are still discussing to this day, such as the localization maturity model, how to tackle return on investment for localization, as well as multicultural marketing, among so many others. And for the sake of today's webcast, Don also shared with us some lesser known facts about himself. So he's a lifelong science fiction reader, enjoying the world's discovery of the metaverse, which hasn't been very timely. He's also a swimmer and a retired master diver. So since this is a unique opportunity to do a deep dive into this new era of post-globalization and do it with a certified dive instructor, let's kick it off with the first question. So Don, hi. In your recent articles that you published this year, you point to the challenges and opportunities of the post-globalization era. So how can localization departments thrive in this new age?
Let me begin by stating the obvious, that globalization is not a simple concept. So at the highest level, it's about integrating and interaction among people, processes, governments, a whole raft of different constituencies coming in. The net effect of that is just that there's a tremendous amount of complexity that results from that. So the opportunity for localization teams and for all of the supporting infrastructure is to come in and tackle that complexity. So just step back for a second and you think of the stuff that a company typically manages as multiple content and document management systems and ERP systems and CRM systems, all meant to provide information, to provide communication channels, and importantly, to create an enduring, compelling customer experience. That all works well if it's in English, but then once you add in some of the things like some issues like a different country, a different language, it gets combinatorially more complex. You add in some of the kinds of technologies that are being used, or different content management systems that might be used in an international operation. It's not the same as it is at the source. And so as you layer on all of these levels of technology and systems and processes and users and languages, the cardinality of that becomes extraordinarily complex, very complicated, and the opportunity ultimately comes down to how can a localization team and its supporting teams make this work in all of the languages for all of the locales without violating any rules, regulations, anyone's privacy. So that's the challenge moving forward. That's the opportunity.
So I'd like to open it up to the audience, because I mean, there's so many directions that this could take. I have a few, but and anyone who isn't speaking, if they could put themselves on mute, we would greatly appreciate it. But would anybody like to ask Don a question based on some of his writings, what he just spoke of just now?
Don, hi, this is Tim. I thought another interesting way, based on that, and I don't mean to sound overly solicitous, but that just excellent blog post. That's rocking. Maybe it'd be useful for you to go over your concept of the splinter net.
We saw an example of this just recently. It was in mainstream news. there's a conflict going on in Ukraine, and as we all know, and one of the cities that was overtaken by the forces, as soon as they took the city, they switched them over to the Russian internet. So, the concept for a lot of people, some friends ask, what is this Russian internet? Isn't it .ru and you're done and dusted? Well, for the Russian internet, there's a regulatory office that everyone has to go through in order to be on the Russian internet. So it's just not a situation where you can say, okay, I want to be in Russia. You have to be, let's say, approved for that. Similarly, for China, there's a number of exit and entry points that are required by in order to be on the Chinese internet. And so this is a movement that we've seen across multiple markets, where you don't have necessarily something that says explicitly local, as those two examples show, but places where there's requirements to adhere to particular tones, or certainly to comply with laws. And those laws are things that what you can say in a particular country, the privacy laws, those various regulations, the commercial laws. These are all things that cause the internet to splinter in infinite ways, not just in these large chunks, but in ways that, like, for example, in that blog I mentioned in the US, there's over 11,000 taxing authorities that if you want to do taxation right online, you've got a big task ahead of you. I just gifted a friend with a digital subscription to a magazine in Indiana, and the price was higher than what I thought it would be. Who would think of a tax on a magazine? But Indiana did. And so it was just something new. So this is the kind of complexity you have to deal with, to know exactly where somebody is, but at the same time you know exactly where they are. You have to know what privacy rules apply, because even knowing where they are may be too much information. And so this splinters on both the regulatory approval side, as well as on individual components of any global strategy.
Interesting. And given the volatility and the kind of complexity and uncertainty that exists, what advice do you have on how to deal with this internally if you're, say, a big technology company that's kind of I guess the word I'm looking for would be a unicorn? Where do you begin? Where do you begin with all of this?
Well, the first step is, I'd like to quote the Music Man here, you got to know the territory. And one of the critical songs in that great musical, which for anyone who's not American, it's a wonderful view into American life and earlier in the 100 years ago. But in any case, what it is there's a salesman coming along, and everyone is saying he doesn't know anything about what he's doing. And the refrain is, you got to know the territory, which means you have to know what the people want. You want to know how they expect to get it. You have to know what the rules are for doing it. You have to be able to actually ask them to pay for it in a currency or in a form that they're able to do it. And then you have to deal with the after customer support kinds of things, or after sale sorts of things. So all of these things come forward as issues that come up, and for sure, the idea of managing a process through that entire stage, from the first contact all the way through to customer support, is a challenge that every company that we talk to has, and consequently, no company is able in any one group, in any one team, even in any one supplier, to have all of the knowledge and the insight that they need in order to be a reliable provider that's within the frame of the law in the country that they're in, without getting some additional help. So that's knowledge which is essential to the particular market, to each market.
And that market research is something that companies such as CSA could provide, correct?
We provide a chunk of it. For example, the Can't Read, Won't Buy research
Right.
that we've been doing for a while. that's just something which is important to know what the preferences are and the expectations. But then, once you know those things, you can just sort of auto-correlate everything that's going to come from that expectation. If you're in Spain, you're going to want to pay in euros, but you have some local laws that deal with that. It'll be a different story in Albania if you're doing any e-commerce there. And so at each step of the way, you have to have something which is specific, and it really gets down to the level of what's hyper local for any kind of experience that you're trying to build. Otherwise, it's easy to just drive off the road, off the tracks, and you wreck the experience for that particular user.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Go ahead, Melissa.
Hi, Don. This is Melissa. I wanted to ask you about whether you have any advice or information about gaps that you see both in within LSPs and in the client space for managing some of this complexity, that the skills just either aren't there or they need to be brought into the operations.
But skills are always a huge challenge across the board. If you have a small localization team inside your company, it would be extraordinarily difficult to find a team that could deal or understand all of these issues, period, just for a particular market. But then to say, on top of this, I want to do this for 6 or 10 or 15 or 80 markets, is to be able to have something that's more than just a superficial localization is really the challenge. So if you step back and say, I sort of look at this from entering a market. The first time you're in a market, you probably want to take the same approach you did when you first met your in-laws or some other friend of a friend that is very important to whoever you're seeing. And you tend to watch where you're going with your conversations. You don't really wear your politics on your sleeve. You don't talk about certain contentious issues. You try to stay within the guideposts or the rails of that particular situation. And that first step is what a lot of companies really end up doing. The net effect of that is it's okay, but it's not the best experience overall. A few years later, you're sitting down with your father-in-law, knocking back a couple of single malts, and it's an interesting, very different kind of conversation. So the advice to any company is to, as you move into a market, is to get an understanding of the depth that you need to be in order to be successful. If the goal is simply marketing, simply marketing is a loaded term in itself, but if you just want to get your presence out there, you can have a kind of a generic site, and you can even repurpose the Spanish that you did for one country and with certain modifications, and in some cases maybe none, make sure that it's okay over in that other market. I'm just working on a report right now on 6 Spanishes for B2C, and even just for 6, there's 3 categories of solutions there, which the number of permutations becomes great. So that's a simple one in terms of language, but then you get into the things like the pricing and payments issue that I mentioned before. And again, you want to look to a specialist in that area. So Melissa, to your point here, it's unlikely that a single department has all of the expertise internally. The challenge to the LSPs they bring in is obviously complicated as well, and it may require in certain markets to say, well, your LSP may say, I really don't know the Bosnian market or Albania or something like that, and you'll look for a local specialist in that area. So it starts adding to complexity in terms of the number of suppliers you need at that point, because each one of them has to be onboarded as well.
So I really like the evolution of the language service providers graphic that you did. And I would have liked to see the evolution of the localization teams within the client side. because it has evolved so much. I mean, we went through being like this, as I was called once, many, many years ago, the translation lady, to becoming that department that is really like doing a strategy for the company, is sitting at the table and doing so much more. And we see in schools that the curriculum has changed quite a bit as well. When you become a localization project manager now, there's a ton of new things that you have to learn beyond, language, right?
Yeah.
So if you can elaborate a little bit more on also that trajectory that we have seen, and maybe one day even create that beautiful graph that you did for the LSPs.
Yeah. Well, actually, we're working on that now. The LMM, the localization maturity model, goes back a dozen or more years. But it goes back even further than that. I started working on that when I was at Forrester in the 90s, and the capability, competency, maturity model that came out of Carnegie Mellon. So this is just one of the probably hundreds of maturity models that particular research effort at CMU generated. So we stand on the shoulders of Carnegie Mellon in doing the localization maturity model. But my colleague Rebecca Ray, as you know, has been working with the LMM for quite some time now, and has posited and put forth with our work the globalization maturity model, and is in the process of extending that as well. As you point out, a lot of stuff has changed over time, and the model will indeed reflect that. And as well, on the LSP side, we put out 6, 7, 8 years ago the LSP metrics model, which is a kind of maturity model for where LSPs are going. And that in turn, as you saw from the graphic, that movement to data scientists, to knowledge process outsourcers, to global content service providers is a comparable kind of evolution of maturity on the LSP side. But back to the to your side of the business, to the demand side, we're definitely working on it. There's a lot of complexity that's involved in that, and that challenge of moving from, again, just for the words that we use, simple localization to complex globalization, with no value judgment on either one of those. Localization by itself is brutal, but going to that at the levels that we're talking about here to create that extraordinary experience everybody wants to give their customers in every market in which they have a presence, that's a huge challenge. It helps if you got a great truck too. So.
Go places.
Did that answer your question, Sylvia? To some degree.
Yeah, thank you.
Don, Tim, did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, actually I did. Thank you. So Don, as I was reading the post, one possibility jumped out at me, and I might be taking too great a leap, but I'm really interested in your opinion. All right, we all know that linguists have been bemoaning the rise of MT, right? Everybody knows that. But I was wondering about the opportunity for linguists to somehow become linguists plus local experts. It could be something as simple as word choice. It could be sort of their own internal style guide, as it were, to move them along. I don't know. Do you have a take on that?
Definitely. And I'm just thinking here of an experience I had back at Easter in Florida, as the representative from the Republic of Massachusetts to some of the people down there. I was asked during Easter dinner with some friends to explain just what this woke thing is. And, as a result of whatever politics you're wearing on your sleeve or whatever you've said in the past, you become a representative of that. And I think the same thing happens with language. I've spent enough time back in my misguided youth studying Russian and Czech and a variety of other Slavic languages. And for all of my friends, even though now, probably after a week or so in one of those places, I'd recover a lot of what I had, but now I stumble. But I'm still the expert on Russia or the Czech Republic, well, Czechia now for a lot of my friends, and so they call me, they text me whenever something happens. I'm the first person they go to, and of course I have my take on it. I know those places, and I know the impact of what it means of any news item on those things. And a linguist, a Russian translator, an Albanian interpreter, somebody like that, certainly has enough knowledge of the environment in which they're working that they'd be able to provide that level of what we call human at the core machine translation in our responsive MT research. What that means is that the computer can take you only so far, but the machine can take you only so far, but then it can answer some of these unsolvable questions. I think this goes back to the philosopher Gödel. Remember Gödel, Escher, Bach, a big book everyone read back in the 80s. He picked up this idea that there were some problems that were unsolvable and some that are solvable. And the solvable ones are sometimes unlikely to be solved or impossible to be solved by machine. And so that human at the core here is that person who can distinguish between, let's say, something as simple as a nuance in a word, that this word is highly charged. Over time, the computer might learn it, but then you look at larger text clumps of text, and the computer might not have enough context to understand what's going on. So you look at some things that are happening now with ASR machine interpreting, that you'll have simultaneous interpreting by machine, but then as you go through, the machine is constantly readjusting as it learns and going back and changing stuff that happened further up. So you can just think of some circumstances where the machine might have translated something this way up here. By the time it got down to here, it said, uh-oh, we just pressed the red button and the world's going to turn to guacamole as a result. So can it get back up to there fast enough before somebody pushes the button? That's really the reductio ad absurdum of this thing. But there is substantial damage that can be caused at any point along the way in terms of reputation or understanding, or at a certain point somebody just turns it off because they say, this doesn't make sense because it was one word wrong. So the computer is always going to be mediated by a human, has to be, and the role of the MT cum linguist, or linguist with MT expertise, is definitely one that is a major role for that group of knowledge process outsourcers and global content providers to make sure that the content is on track. And a thing that I've been using, going back to the Business Without Borders book, or actually stuff I was writing at Forrester in the 90s, is the content has to be correct, it has to be current, and it has to be consistent with what the results are, whether you're talking about in English or across languages. And that linguist is going to be a critical part, making sure that in the training regimen for that machine, that continues to be the case.
Don, will the linguist also continue to be relevant? There was a time where we thought MT made had the potential to make a linguist not relevant. Now, will artificial intelligence be able to take that MT at some point, and maybe should that be the concern of the linguistic community, or how will they play a part in that, in your mind?
The big question with AI always comes back to when the singularity is, what Ray Kurzweil has been writing about for years. And the date keeps coming in as the technology keeps getting faster. I think it was in yesterday's New York Times, was a great article on AI and the challenges that companies have, that individuals have with AI, that at what point is it going to be what we call responsible? Some research that my colleague Arl Lamel and I worked on earlier this year. We came up with this notion of going from adaptive to responsive MT is the next wave for this technology, and it's important. I was joking with my wife. She's listening to some audiobook, and there's some god-awful accent that the reader comes up with for a Cockney speaker, and it's just grating through the boom. And I'm walking through the room or walking past, and there's somebody talking in a nice measured, cultured British accent, English accent, and all of a sudden this comes blasting at you, and you think about, okay, what happens if you get that kind of, uh, uh, let's say, intermixing in a presentation or in something on video that you're watching? Can the machine really catch up? Can it provide that contextual shift that the voice is providing there, that, oh, this is all of a sudden somebody different and way different than this other speaker. And so there's this personality that's been created. So in responsive MT, that person is also speaking in a different speech register, different vocabulary. As I said, it's more Cockney. So the net effect of that is now the machine has to change in order to understand that this person is speaking in a different register, a different dialect, and indeed with something that'll knock it right off the charts on the view meters, which actually years ago when I was at INYAZ, the Moscow Institute of Foreign Languages, as an American speaker that didn't have a terrible accent, they took me down to the language lab one day and had me record some of their speech or language lessons in English, just to see if it was part of their move from British English to American English. And I shifted my voice for the different speakers, and in the control booth behind the glass, the sound engineer went like that. He pulled his headphones off, just because I did that, and he had no expectation that that was going to happen. Just as a computer would have no expectation that there's going to be this fundamental shift in tone and just the speech length and all of the things that fit in there. So humans are critical, and they have a for the foreseeable future, going back to Gödel, I think the humans will be solving those unsolvable machine issues for quite some time. That doesn't get to there's another issue we can talk about, which is just, are we training enough linguists, period. But that's another question.
Yeah. Go ahead, Tim, if you want to.
Okay, thanks. Hey, Don, yeah, thanks. Very clear on that. Sort of back to the splinternet and linguists. Do you think that linguists could be an and the expert on local taxation? I mean, do you think that this is a viable thing, and the expert on what are the local privacy laws to help guide the LSPs or the end user buyer in situations like this?
At the very least, the linguist could point the tax experts to the appropriate materials in the Bratislava tax office, and then translate those materials and interpret something for the linguist or for the tax person. So yeah, it's an in-house resource, and similarly, as any good LSP, any good translator will do, there's a tremendous amount of work that goes into translation that just doesn't really get paid for. Some of the research. My daughter's a freelancer in Tokyo and is native speaker of English, but pretty proficient in Japanese. And I'll talk to her sometimes, and she'll say that she's researching something. It's not something she's getting paid for, but she wants to make sure she does a darn good translation. And so, that kind of expertise is something that the linguist definitely brings to the table, is to be that navigator to the materials that will make, and the sources that'll make that translation so much better. And legal in the case of taxation.
I think these are just such interesting and new topics, and Don is definitely the person who has all the insights. But I was thinking about also the hyperlocal aspect of it all, and I love that in the new graphs from CSA research, you also have a bigger focus on the inclusivity and on the fact that the new linguists and the new translators perhaps would be used for all the hyperlocal social media support, maybe, and we are already seeing that at Vistatec, that suddenly we need influencers for our clients in the language, right, to kind of serve to this purpose of hyperlocal content. So yeah, curious to know about your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, actually, there was a conscious decision last year when we started the research on this, that probably shouldn't be a me or Oral being the lead analyst on that, but somebody who would increase our inclusiveness. More than half our team is female. So it's an important element is to recognize that in this industry, and some research that we did several years ago in conjunction with, in cooperation with several industry associations for gender, we call it the gender survey, is we found a substantial number of women in the industry, and consequently that was one of the things that drove that research. You take into account any other underrepresented, say in terms of visibility groups, by race or nationality or whatever else, that really complicates the situation as well. And importantly, I don't know if you noted a couple months ago or so, an activity that gets back to the splinternet, the state that Buenos Aires is in decided that there was not going to be any use of that gender neutral pronoun in Buenos Aires. And for us here in the Republic, or in one of our fellow republics on the West Coast, this is something that's just a matter of course. And the biggest challenge has been in this kind of discussion of inclusivity is who the they in a particular conversation refers to. Is it the they formerly known as a she, or is it they group of this people? So that's interesting. But the thing that I always go down this next path on is you take it up to the next level of corporate social responsibility and ESG, environment, social governance, those kinds of things. And all of a sudden, you get some really interesting issues here. So, for example, with Buenos Aires, you can't have that pronoun in Buenos Aires, or you're illegal. You've broken a law. I don't know if they take you off in shackles or whatever, but something happens. But just looking at something, we did some research on CSR for one of our CEO summits, just what these companies were doing themselves. And I'm thinking, okay, CSR is a good idea. Gender equality, human rights. These are all things that we grew up with in this era of social liberalism that followed World War II and really guided the 90s so much for so many of us. And the CSR that's appropriate for the United States is not necessarily going to be all that well received in Moscow or Beijing or Budapest. You've got groups that, and again, not any value judgments here, but they have their notion of what is socially responsible in those countries. And we have, in the United States, our idea, but even our idea here is not necessarily one that everybody agrees to. I go back to my Easter dinner where, when I gave the definition of woke, I just got blasted for all of this stuff. Well, what about? And so whataboutism, is something that should be part of the role of this human sitting in the flow of information for any new market entry that you're doing. That that person's job is to say, what about the fact they don't think gender rights are that important? What about the fact that Basque people don't really consider themselves to be part of Spain? So you've got color maps as well, which everybody's been burned on at some point. Actually, I remember too in our annual rankings one year listing a certain place that another country considers to be part of it, and getting blasted in a series of emails for that. And it's just so we switched from country to location just in the research. So you have to find those ways around it. You have to find the ways where it's not going to be seen as, by some people, as caving in, or by other people as an unnecessary complication. But you just have to make it feel natural. So that's a huge job for any company operating internationally.
Well, not only that, we're starting to see it break down, not just internationally, but to the point where it's breaking down state by state. In Florida, you have to be careful about your gender neutral talk as well, or the beginnings of that is taking place. So we have a couple questions, if I may. One is from Ronald Zagara. Good morning, Dawn and everyone. Thank you for conducting this great initiative. In your opinion, is there something like over-localization? And where is the line between hyper-localization and true brand authenticity drawn? Good question. Good question, Ron.
That's a great question. I would have to say just a priori, it depends. The classic refuge of a tough question here. Brand authenticity is that's a mark that every company aims for. The question of can you over localize that brand for a market? Hopefully the style guide, the brand guide, is going to say what the parameters of that thing are. That you're not going to, let's say, put just trying to think. You're not going to put a Spanish flag over the Nike swoosh.
No.
As a matter of fact, once I had a Nike swoosh in a presentation, just as actually it was at the Guild Council, and there was someone from Nike in the room who said, "Get rid of that right away." So I did. So there's strong brand protection. So I'm not worried about the brand authenticity. The over localization. That's a good question where you could get it to the point where it's so localized that it no longer fits within the templates or the guide rails that you have for your system. So, ideally, there'll be some percentage of content which is global that's easily manipulated or adapted for world markets for each of the languages. But if you get to the point where then when you localize it for, I always go to Albania. When you localize it for Albania, do you localize it in a way that then makes it difficult to go back to the original? So is there a second level of localization? And that's really going to be a question of budgeting and corporate direction and just the whole what you want to do in a particular market. It may be necessary in a particular market to really exceed or over excel in order to make sure that everyone feels comfortable, because there's some dark ghost in your past of some egregious faux pas that you made or some other reason. But at the end of the day, it comes down to not adding more than you're actually willing to, able, or comfortable, further modifying once you've gone through your usual translation localization activity.
Thank you for that. We have another question from Jonathan Turpin. We're seeing that accessibility and localization are crossing over more and more through the years. Based on the MT discussion, how do you think that is impacting the translators and MT learning?
This is another great question. We've all, with the most recent, if you're a Microsoft Word user, or in PowerPoint, you've seen some, some AI-driven suggestions from the system that in order to be more accessible, you should do this or you shouldn't do that. So the challenge here is at what point are these suggestions going to flow over into the MT engine? That it'll say at some point in the written MT that this isn't going to fly very well as is, you should adapt it. So what kinds of suggestions are popped up? In terms of just some of the other things going on, you look at hate speech or inappropriate speech. All of these things have to be picked up by the AI and whatever tool you're using, should be reflected in the machine learning work you're doing. And so this really gets back to the question of, God, what was the name of that? Was it Tay at Microsoft a few years ago? The bot that they had that became, within the course of a day, it was spouting, racist and alt-right slogans and things like that because of training coming from people who had overwhelmed the bot input. So these are all things that you have to factor in. And getting back to the point of the human in the loop here, it's not just human in the loop, it's human in the core, to make sure that you have somebody assigned to deal with those unsolvable problems, or just this overflow or deluge of data coming in that can wipe out all of your best intentions.
So sifting through the noise, so to speak.
Yeah. And I'm sure,
Anastasia, go ahead.
yeah,
Sorry.
I'm sure there'll be tools coming along to do this, and I know some suppliers are working on technology to deal with some of these issues, but there are definitely things that need to be dealt with.
Absolutely. Anastasia, did you have a question?
Oh, hi. Yes, I tried to write my question, but something was probably my type of version of Zoom, so I can't find how to ask. So I will ask it. Actually, it's not a question. It's more like a suggestion that I think that we follow a lot of gender inclusivity guidelines and really forget about other types of inclusivity like mental or physical ones. And there are a lot of people that has it, and our speech or like text that we translate can really hurt them.
It's an excellent observation, and so true. You know, the thing is, you know, in our society, this is not something which uh, causes a lot of disagreement. You know, among us, there's certainly an understanding that this is something that has to be done. That isn't the case everywhere. And I'll refer back to my non-woke friends in Florida, that, you know, coming up and saying that in addition to treating women with the deference or the respect that they deserve, along with anybody else, really is what it should be. There's a whole raft of things that need to be considered whenever you have a translation, whenever you're doing and interpreting, whenever you're localizing for something. It's not just, and obviously it's not just the question of language, the appropriate language, but it's also, you know, you get into, you know, coloration and things like that. Something that we constantly hear from our proofreader is that this particular color combination is not going to be visible to anybody with, you know, any kind of. So we've got this narrow color band now that we do that. In terms of you know, the mental health issue, you know, there's words that are very hurtful that are just a matter of everyday speech, just, you know, colloquial speech that everybody has, and you have to be, you know, you just don't want to get that into your writing, and you're embarrassed if you say something hurtful when there's somebody in the room who would be hurt by it. So these are things where people need controls on what they do, and this is an area where the machine is in an excellent position not only to do the Tay mess that it did for Microsoft, but also to understand, to flag anything which is inappropriate and make sure that it's understood, and really to red flag that to make sure that you don't cause any damage.
You bring up a good point, Kim Kardashian, and this isn't mental health, but she named her Skims company originally Kimono, and there was some cultural issue that came up from that where she was forced to change the name of the company because of her insensitivity or lack of knowledge or ignorance to the topic. She was forced to change the name to Skims, so just kind of a fun fact.
Yeah.
I have kind of a high philosophical question, but does anybody else have any questions?
Mine can wait till the end. It's about
No.
globalization.
Well, I
Yeah,
saw
please
you
go ahead.
there.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. I saw you nodding, and I know how much you're doing in the MTC
Yes.
right now. So go ahead.
Please
This
do.
actually has nothing to do with MT. So Don, when I first read the first sentence of the blog, I thought, oh my God, I fought so hard for this globalization title, and now it's going to go away. But that's actually not what what your blog was about. And if anything, it's just pointing out the almost the opposite. You know, we almost need more of it. You know, and you're the end of the line of, you know, it's the end of globalization as we know it. And of course, REM came to mind. Should we feel fine?
Yeah.
Is that what your conclusion kind of came to as well?
Well, actually, the original title of this was "It's the End of Globalization and We Feel Fine." But you know, our Melissa, who said that there's a generation that might not know REM, so I moved it to the end. So, but you know, my point of view here is I'm a long-term, you know, let's say, advocate of globalization. I think the world would be better if, not that we make everybody the same, but that we, have some common practices and interactions and integrations and things that work everywhere that'll allow us to get into some of these complexities and make things more appropriate in the different markets, but not block it so that we can't do it. So not to splinter the internet, but to make the internet smarter than it is now. And you go back to always go back to Friedman. I think I mentioned it in the blog. Back in '96, he was saying that a country's made it when it's got McDonald's and Windows 95. And you think about that. He also said in a subsequent book that no two countries with a McDonald's in each country have been at war, and that's been blown out of the water as well. So all of the visible signifiers of 1990s, early 2000s globalization have been sort of pushed to the side. And the challenge now is if you want to be in a country that has its own internet, you have to get through that bar to be there, or get over that bar. So the right approvals, the right authorities, and if your software, if your base systems, if your providers are all able to support that effort, to say, okay, I'm going to go down this particular path, this rabbit hole in order to get into that market, you have to document it as you go along. You have to make sure that there's a process so that it's reproducible. One-offs are a disaster in any industry. And in translation, you'd end up, rather translating or localizing a website or a document, you can end up in some real dead ends. So the net effect here is to make sure that you have the people who can do the work, that you can find them, you can hire them, you can keep them on board, and you can keep everybody happy.
And along that same line, provide the sandwiches that are going to work in those particular markets.
Yeah, and it's past lunchtime for me, so I'm looking forward.
I had a similar response to your blog as Carrie. My first response is, oh shit, I'm not going to have a job in 5 years. What am I going to do? But to take the airplane up to maybe 50,000 feet, archaeologists say that because of the internet, mankind is no longer has enough variation and differentiation, so that we're going to be it will be the demise of us, because we're becoming too I think of the word as homogenous or blended. Is it the same for language? Where do you and I know you don't have a crystal ball, but where do you see that going in that regards?
Well, just taking the Buenos Aires example, or this week California saying it might get rid of gasoline-powered cars by 2035. That diversity is out there. The challenge is to be able to deal with all of the complications that come with it. And so, at the core, the Chinese internet, the Albanian internet, that whatever Indians are doing to block, in that blog I mentioned, the TikTok competitor, all of these things are all using the same core technologies. They're using, internet protocols. They're using classic, networking endpoints and all of that. And the routers are the same, but sometimes the routers block you from going to various places. So at the end of the day, all of this stuff is doable. It's just what you have to do is know what's going to happen at some point along the way, that you're going to have to do a workaround in order to make that thing work. That workaround may be a simple switch, or it could be just a different translation for that particular market. So this gets
a bit Darwinistic. Those that are pliable will survive as we bend with the change. But the one thing that is for sure is change.
Yeah.
So we do have a question from an Alfonso Gonzalez. What do you think of the role SEO plays in translation, localization, transcreation, and the lack of skill? Oops, sorry about that. That went to a different spot. My apologies. And the lack of skilled linguists able to apply those skills to their translation, and machines being still far from being able to do that. I can repeat that if you want.
Yeah, no, I got the idea here. Well, what there is a a string of causality here. We talked before about linguists being able to do something other than translate or interpret. So that's one thing is, have they been trained to look for SEO? Are there tools that they have that identify the keywords that are necessary? You know, there's a lot of tools that'll scrape a website. They should be scraping the company if they're not working for that company, but instead for an LSP. Scrape the site and find out what their keywords are. Make sure all of those are translated. Work with the marketing team for that company to ensure that these are the keywords that really mean something to them. You know, none of this is rocket science. It's just, you know, talking to the people who are doing it and using the tools that are there. So web scraping tools, you know, they've been around for decades now.
Yeah.
What we need to see is the tools coming from the language technology vendors, you know, RWS and MemoQ and, you know, Smartly and whoever else, to make sure that those are smarter, because those tools should be picking up clues and keywords throughout. And if the company itself, you know, the content owner is smart enough, they'll make this information available immediately upon engaging with a translator.
And Julia Greco's comments is there are linguists that are well versed in international multilingual SEO. Actually, you just have to find them.
You got to find them.
Good comment. Thank you. So mindful of the time, we have 3 minutes left. Don, can you tell us a little bit about CSA and what you guys do and what we can look forward to in the future with you?
Well, I'll look to the past for a second, because this is the 20th anniversary year of CSA research, formerly known as Common Sense Advisory. And it's also the 20 years in a couple of weeks since Business Without Borders was published by John Wiley and Sons. So that picked up on some themes that I had started on Forrester. And then the first few reports that we wrote at CSA were essentially based on what would have been the next book in that series. So I know many of you on the, at least on this screen here. For those who don't know CSA, the important thing is we're a market research company. There's a few words in our tagline that are really critical to what we do. It's independent, objective, comprehensive research that you can trust. The whole point of trust here is that we're data-based. What we do is we do surveys, we do qualitative focus groups, and a lot of interviews. And so that information comes back to us. It's directly from large samples, and what we, in the case of surveys, and what we do then is we can validate that with, it's a representative sample. The net effect is we're not polling a couple of companies and you know, making decisions based or conclusions based on that. Importantly, you know, with all of this, so much is happening, as a couple of you said. We have to stay ahead of the curve. So there's one MT, getting back to you know, our favorite whipping boy here. We said in 2012 that there would be a lot of human enhanced MT. That was the next wave coming out of the statistical and rule based. And then we came up with the idea of augmented translation, which was that human at the core. So that essential element of humanity in making sure this stuff was done correctly. And we added to that earlier this year, last year, with responsive and responsible MT. So these next waves of what MT has to do in order to do its job. And you know, we're well before the singularity. So there's a lot of training that remains to be done. Let's see, we've also done pro bono work. So I mentioned the gender. We're looking to do some more of that. Had the Africa survey come out earlier this year as well. And,
well, we're looking, we're
yeah.
definitely, go ahead.
Oh, finally, I was just going to say, you know, this at some level, we used to joke if my early days at Forrester, gee, I would do this even if they weren't paying me. It was so much fun because everyone would take your call. And so this is not just a job for us. It's something that, it's a credo that we all live by. And so as long as we can contribute to the market to make sure people are doing the right things, or aware of the things they should be doing, then we'll have done our job in you know, helping make the world a better place.
We are definitely looking forward to watching what you guys produce. It's always compelling and interesting. I remember being 13 years ago, brand new to localization, and I picked up a piece, and my boss, Andrew Bradenkamp, said, read this. And it was your writing, and I was just like, wow, these people are so smart. I'm so excited to be here. So we're looking forward to watching what your company does. Domi and I want to thank everybody for attending the episode 6 of All Things Global, powered by Vistatec. Of course, it goes without saying, we work with the most iconic brands around the globe for translation, localization, linguistic testing, language quality review, anything that you need. Please don't hesitate to reach out. We'd love to assist you. And we look forward to seeing you at the next All Things Global, powered by Vistatec. Thank you and have a wonderful rest of your summer.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.